Thanks very much to all of you for coming. Well, welcome to this week's edition of our Students Talk Back political lunch panel discussion. And as we do every other week, we're very, very fortunate to be joined by our friend, Professor Bob Shrum. As most of you know, Bob currently serves as the USC Dornsife, Carmen, and Lewis Warshaw Chair in Practical Politics. He is a veteran political consultant who's worked on 8 presidential campaigns, nearly 30 winning U.S. Senate campaigns, and 8 winning gubernatorial campaigns. And for those of you who did not hear, just last week was inducted into the American Association of Political Consultants Hall of Fame. So welcome and congratulations, Bob Shrum.
I never thought I had a chance to get into the other Hall of Fame.
Yeah, Pete Rose is coming next week, and we'll talk about it then. In the meantime, though, we're very, very fortunate to be joined by a friend of ours and a USC alum, Brian Kaye. And Brian is the opinion editor for the Orange County Register and newly appointed as a member of the paper's executive committee. Is that correct? He's also the editor-in-chief of CalWatchdog.com, which is an independent Sacramento-based journalism venture providing investigative reports and news stories covering California state government. And he's also the vice president of the public policy think tank, the Claremont Institute. Brian, welcome back to campus. As always, we're happy to have you here.
Thanks.
Yay. And so I'm going to be joined in our questioning of our guest today by Alex Glaser. Alex is a poli-sci major and works with us at the Unruh Institute in the offices. Alex, thank you so much for being here. Alex, why don't you get us started on the questioning?
So my first question is for Professor Shrum. Hillary Clinton is expected to announce her candidacy in the next month. How do you think her campaign will differ in 2016 in comparison to 2008?
It better. When she announced in 2008, she sat on a couch in Chappaqua and had like a 3-minute video where she said, and some students in my classes have seen this, where she said, well, we have these big issues. We have health care, and we have our economy, and we have foreign policy questions, and I look forward to having a conversation with you about them. I mean, there was no sense of vision. There was no sense of forward-looking thrust. She ran as a candidate of restoration in a year of change. She needs to give an announcement speech in front of real human beings that is eloquent, energizing, and has a sense of vision that looks to the future. I think she will do that. I think that's one of the reasons they haven't moved as quickly as they otherwise might have, because they've been getting ready to do that, and I think she has to do it. She, in an odd way, I wouldn't say she's been helped, but recent events have so lowered sort of expectations, and people expect in some ways to see the same old Hillary coming out again, that if it isn't the same old Hillary, it's really going to help her, it's going to help her redefine herself, and it's going to help her redefine the race.
And so just to follow up on that, Bob, what you mentioned as recent events, I'm guessing that among other things you're talking about this controversy over the emails that she sent during her time as Secretary of State. And my impression from previous conversations that we've had is that you don't see this having much, if any, impact on the race going forward. But talking about the old Hillary versus the new Hillary, you're not all that impressed by how she and her nascent campaign handled it. Is that right?
Well, let me say 2 things about it. First, I think she should have dealt with it immediately. And second, I think she should have had a very straightforward explanation where she didn't talk about her yoga class or her daughter's wedding or any of that stuff. And I certainly wouldn't have given it standing in front of a replica of Picasso's Guernica at the United Nations.
Although that's an awesome painting.
It's an awesome painting, but the subject matter is somehow or other. In any event, I think she should have come out right away and said, assuming it's true, and I think it may be, that she never thought much about it. She was in a transition from the Senate, where that email was gone, to the State Department, and her husband had this email system. She used it. No one ever told her she couldn't. which I think is true. And so it was a mistake. But it was a mistake. She should have started with the line, it was a mistake. But, you know, I was in this transition, here's how it happened, and, you know, I wish it hadn't happened this way. She would have been a lot better off. The second thing I would say is that while in the end, I don't think voters getting to the point of decision in November of 2016 are going to say, I think she's right on student loans, I think she's right on jobs, I think she's right on raising the minimum wage and economic fairness. I can't vote for her because of those emails. I just don't think real voters think that way. But it was certainly not the way you would choose to reintroduce yourself or to begin to preview your campaign, and she really was reintroducing herself after being Secretary of State. So I think in that sense it hurt her. It sort of bent the arc of the narrative, and it also indicated something I think is very important. Journalism, political journalism, abhors a vacuum. The Democratic Party right now in the nominating process is essentially a vacuum. That is, there's one person and that's it, and nobody takes anybody else very seriously. So I think it's an indication that she does have an opponent for the nomination, a formidable one, the press. Which would like to get Elizabeth Warren into the race. Boston Globe spent a whole Sunday opinion section trying to get Elizabeth Warren to run. I think the Vice President Biden would like to run, and when he looks at these events may think, yeah, maybe I should. But beyond other candidates running, I think she's going to have to run herself a constant press gauntlet where everything in both her past and her campaign will be subject to intense scrutiny, because they can't say Hillary Clinton today won the argument with Joe X about where the Democratic Party should go on Y. And without that, you got to cover something. Amy Chozick of the New York Times has to cover this story. You know, so the piece she's working on now, I know, is about what's happened with previous, has there ever been a situation like this, number one? And number two, if there has been a situation like this, what has happened? How has it played out? That's a story that, it's a good story, but it wouldn't occur if there were other serious candidates running.
Bob, thanks very much. Hey, Brian, we want to get to the Republican field in just a second. But because we've begun this conversation, like most conversations about the 2016 presidential election, by talking about Secretary Clinton, before we get to the Republican field, maybe you can give us some analysis from the other side of the fence.
Sure. I mean, you know, I'm not convinced yet that Hillary Clinton will be the nominee. I think that the Democrats have an interesting history of not wanting to nominate the next in line. Like, Republicans always want to nominate the next in line. It's John McCain's turn. It's Mitt Romney's turn. It was Richard Nixon's turn. It was Ronald Reagan's turn. But the Democrats aren't necessarily like that. They like the kind of fresh, the new. And the hard progressive base of the Democratic Party doesn't like Hillary Clinton. I think that's evidenced by what the Boston Globe did last weekend. I think that's evidenced by MoveOn.org spending money to recruit anyone but Clinton. I think that's evidenced by you know, Howard Dean's group spending $250,000 to try to find someone else that's not Hillary Clinton to run for the Democratic nomination for president. So I'm not necessarily convinced it will be, as some people are calling, a coronation for Hillary Clinton. You know, former Governor O'Malley from Maryland is obviously running for president. I don't think that Joe Biden is considering running for president. I think he is running for president. His son, who is the Attorney General, I believe, of Delaware, has been going around, or South Dakota, has been going around. And
Delaware.
What's that right?
Delaware.
Delaware, okay, good. Has been going around.
I think he got elected in South Dakota.
No, not with the energy boom. And I think that he's already making the rounds, making calls on behalf of his father. So I think you're already seeing the moves there. And there's some people who are suggesting that even Al Gore will jump into the race as well, because they're seeing vulnerabilities with Secretary Clinton. So I'm not 100% convinced that Hillary will be the nominee. That's not to say that she won't be. If I had to put money on it right now, I think she would be. But I think that there's much more to be seen before this political process unfolds, because the reality of democratic politics and progressive politics in our country today is that you have a very progressive ideological president in the White House, one could argue. And the progressive base of the party wants to see that legacy extended, not in any way pulled back. And Clinton, much like her husband, is viewed by many within their own party as a compromiser in a way that President Obama has proven not to be.
So, Mr. Kaye, though we may see other prominent Democratic candidates emerge in the future, say Clinton is the Democratic nominee for now,
Take a flight of fancy.
Sure.
which Republicans would be the strongest candidates to run against her?
Can we hit the reset button and then maybe, I don't know. It's interesting, you know, I've met with almost all of them at this point, with the exception of Jeb Bush, with whom I'll meet privately on Monday. And I would have said, if you asked me 2 weeks ago, I probably would have said Scott Walker. But I think that all the things that Scott Walker was great about in Wisconsin isn't coming across in his national profile. He doesn't have the depth of conviction on immigration reform, on national issues generally, on foreign policy. So we're going to have to watch to see what happens with Scott Walker, because right now polls are suggesting Republicans love the current Wisconsin governor. You know, if I had to say who I think would do the best against Hillary Clinton on a debate stage with the potential to unite a base of Republicans that's very difficult to unite to begin with, which I can talk about in a second, and have crossover appeal, I think that the one person who might be able to do that is Marco Rubio, but he's still untested. And the thing about, and he's not a governor, which is another problem. If you talk to Republican donors and you talk to the Republican base, what they really want now is a governor. They have this narrative that senators don't know how to be presidents, and this is evidenced by Barack Obama. This is them speaking, not Brian speaking. And we want a governor to be the next president. We want a governor to be the next president. And so that's why Marco Rubio might have a bigger challenge. But the interesting thing I think about Marco Rubio is obviously that he brings kind of a different vibe to the Republican Party. But also, he's incredibly articulate and doesn't require the type of preparation many of these other candidates require, right? You can bring Marco Rubio into this room or any room with any experts, and he can talk about issues.
As long as you bring a bottle of water.
Yes, as long as you bring, that's very true. That's why I have 2 bottles of water down here. So he seems to me to be the most interesting of the candidates right now. And you have to remember, you know, putting together a Republican winning strategy for the presidency is very difficult, because there's 4 factions within the Republican primary base that you have to satisfy, and they're typically at odds with each other. You have to satisfy the people who are most concerned with foreign policy and military affairs. You have to essentially appease social conservatives, which are a very powerful voting bloc, who didn't come out to vote for McCain and didn't come out to vote for Mitt Romney. You have to appease economic conservatives, and then you have to appease libertarians. And so the last 2 Republican presidents that were able to do that very effectively for 2 consecutive terms were Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. And if you can't do that as a Republican, you can't win. And with the changing demographics of our country, it's hard to do that and then pivot and appeal to a crossover base of Democrats and independents who are on the fence.
So going off of that, do you think in the Republican primary it's more important for the candidates to attack Clinton in the primary, or instead to attack and differentiate themselves from each other?
I think that they don't need to spend time attacking Clinton, because no one within the Republican base is even thinking to vote for Hillary Clinton at all. And the Republican Party does a terrible job when they decide to spend all of their time focusing on what the other guys are doing or the other gals are doing. What they need to do is they need to define what the modern Republican Party looks like and what a modern set of governing principles look like. Even in this Congress, which is now controlled by Republicans in both the House and Senate, we haven't really seen this is what we stand for and this is what the new Republican Party can do for you. And they need to be more self-reflective, I think, than looking across the aisle and pointing fingers, because I think that the American populace wants ideas and they want to know what this Republican Party is going to do for them. And if you look at exit polls, and Dan knows this better than I do, the thing that, we could talk about all sorts of things about Mitt Romney and why he lost and why Obama won, but the one consistent thing in exit polls that you saw about Mitt Romney was that they did not believe Mitt Romney cared about them and their everyday problems and priorities. And I think that's a bigger problem for the Republican Party, because I think most people would see plug in any Republican in that particular place and say, well, they don't really care about me and my daily struggles.
So we gave Brian a chance to give his thoughts on Secretary Clinton and the potential others in the Democratic field. And so in just a minute, we want to give Bob a chance to weigh in on behalf of Senator Cruz, which I know he's been itching to do.
I endorse Cruz for the Republican nomination.
But before we do, I want to
I endorse Biden.
But before we cross-pollinate, I want to ask Brian one more question about the Republican field. You've had the opportunity, given the roles that you play at the Register and in Claremont and elsewhere, you've had a remarkable opportunity over the last several months to meet, as you said, with every single candidate, save Bush, and that's coming next. You talked about what the Republican nominee would need to do in order to be successful. Based on those meetings, can you offer us some impressions that you've gathered?
Sure.
In having a chance to talk with the
Yeah, I mean, here's my thing. Like, so I'm a millennial. I'm the oldest possible millennial because I was born in 1980, but I'm still a millennial nonetheless. And so there are issues that I know are important to my generation and to me that I need to see a Republican candidate just acknowledge. And so, I think that the Republican Party can make a very strong case when made the right way on economic policy, fiscal policy, and taxation, when they talk about it in a way that's broadening the base and helping everyone. But I think there's some areas where the Republican Party and whoever the eventual nominee really needs to up their game, so to speak. One is on the environment. I think that, especially those of us who live in California, and I know some of you probably aren't native Californians, but now you live here and you're like, oh my God, this place is awesome. If you're in California, you're like, look, I love what we have. It's beautiful. I want clean water. I want clean air. So yeah, the government has some role in environmental regulations. Not an extreme role, but definitely a role. I think secondarily that the Republican Party has to start understanding, and whoever the candidate is that there are certain cultural issues that have already been fought and won and fought and lost. And for one, they need to come out and just say, you know what, gay marriage is here and we support gay marriage for a variety of reasons. I think the same is true of marijuana legalization. I'm a little bit radical on this because I'm libertarian. But I think the biggest one of all of those is that the Republican Party has a terrible track record on education and education reform issues, and they need to start talking about education in a positive and constructive way. If many of you remember from 2012 on the stand when Republicans were talking about reforming education if they were elected president, whether it was Newt Gingrich or Mitt Romney or Rick Santorum or whoever it was, sorry, there are certain ones I can barely speak their name. It's like speaking, Voldemort or something like that, he who shall not be named. But the thing that each and every one of them said was, oh, abolish the Department of Education, abolish the Department of Education, abolish the Department of Education. And I get that. Like, we could have a constructive debate just on abolish the Department of Education, but the average American hears that and says, this is the party that's anti-education. And if you're someone like me who's half Latino and grew up in a very poor area and whose mother had to literally fake a utility bill in a richer area to get her to go to a better high school so that he could have a better life and eventually come to USC, you understand that, like, education is still one of the few ways for upward mobility in this country. And if you're a Republican and you talk constructively about that, you empathize with people. And so none of them have impressed me on any of those issues yet, which is probably why I'm kind of like, and save Marco Rubio, who I think is still very interesting. And I'm curious to see what Jeb Bush has to say on it on Monday, so we will see.
Bob, your thoughts on the Republican field and whether running against them would be more or less difficult than running against the kind of agenda that Brian just articulated?
First, by the way, I'm not a millennial. I'm an ancient of ancients. It would be very difficult to run against the kind of Republican that we just heard described. That would take politics back to being played, we were talking about at the 40-yard line, which we were talking about before the session. and a Republican Party that was fiscally conservative and socially liberal would be quite competitive, depending on circumstances in the country. And that goes to your education point, by the way, because you can't just be against all social safety net programs, all government programs. If you look at the exit polls from 2012, contrary to what a lot of people have assumed about Latinos, they are not natural Republicans. They, in fact, are more pro-government action generally than the population as a whole. Secondly, I think if the Republican donor class is resistant to Marco Rubio because he's a senator, they're misreading history. I don't think Harry Truman was a bad president. I think he was a pretty good president, and he was out of the Senate by about 3 months when he became president. I don't think JFK was a bad president. I certainly don't think Lyndon Johnson, until he blundered into Vietnam, was a bad president. Richard Nixon's another case altogether because he had some other problems. So I think that's a very poor way to make the judgment here. I think that the strongest Republican is from Florida. And I don't know whether that's Jeb Bush, I think it may very well be, or whether it's Marco Rubio. Jeb Bush has all the establishment money. And it's been harder and harder each cycle for the Republicans to, establishment to impose the next guy in line. It was, you know, it was relatively easy for Bush in 2000. It was harder for McCain in 2008. I mean, for heaven's sake, Romney was struggling with Santorum at the end of the process. And if you look at the numbers, you know, in Iowa, for example, Bush has a 41 favorable and a 40 unfavorable among potential caucus goers, and he has to deal with that. So it's not clear to me that he can get nominated. It is possible for a party to lose its head, to use David Broder's phrase, which he applied to the Goldwater nomination in 1964. And it could happen here. I guess you could see the nomination of a Ted Cruz or a Rand Paul. The establishment will do everything it can, and a lot of non-establishment Republicans will do everything they can to prevent that because they think that's a recipe for losing 35 states. I think if Rand Paul were the nominee, John McCain would hold his nose and go in and vote for Hillary Clinton for president because he can't live with Rand Paul's view of national security and the way you should operate in the world. If you want to watch this unfold, Iowa is probably, unless Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio wins Iowa, it will not be that important this time in the process. If it does the predictable thing and picks a Cruz, a Paul, someone like that, it won't be that important. If it picks Scott Walker, then his big challenge is what he does next in New Hampshire. Although I agree with you. I thought at the beginning Scott Walker was going to be a very strong candidate. He still looks to me not ready for prime time. I mean, you know, when he's sitting there on a Sunday show and they say, well, would you put boots on the ground to fight ISIS? And he says yes. You say, who briefed this guy? Yeah. You know, who thought this through? I mean, nobody at this point unequivocally, I think, would say that. Not even McCain, who hasn't met a war he doesn't like. So I think there will be huge pressure inside the Republican Party to get to Jeb Bush. If not to Jeb Bush, to Scott Walker, if he can somehow or other grow into the role, and I have my doubts about that, or to Marco Rubio. And the reason I think that someone from Florida would be the strongest nominee is if Rubio or Bush was the nominee, I think they would probably take John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, as their running mate, and really increase the prospects that they win Florida and Ohio. Now, not in 2004 or 2000, that would have been it. Today, the whole landscape has changed, and Democrats have yet a third route to the presidency. It's a harder route demographically for Republicans, but if Democrats can carry Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, they can still get to 270 electoral votes they need. But the strongest combination would be a Florida-Ohio combination.
Well, at this point, as most of you know by now, when we get to the halfway point, we like to open it to questions from all of you. And for those of you who have not been here before, just two requests on our part. One, when we call on you, if you can tell us who you are, so we know who's joining the conversation. And second, in particular, if you have a question for one of our panelists or the other with whom you happen to disagree, we'd ask that you ask your question with the same respect and regard for their opinion that you'd hope they'd show for yours.
And that Ted Cruz has for, say, Barack Obama.
Maybe more the former than the latter. Questions? Yes, and you are?
I'm Nathaniel. I'm a political science and economics major. There was an article in Slate this morning written by an environmental conservative that said represent the new face of the party. So curious.
I think he's already running. I mean, I think that that's this is somewhat on the record because there's a camera in the room.
Very quickly, Brian, I'm sorry to interrupt, but for those of you in back who may not have heard Nathaniel, his question was about South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham and the possibility that he may run for president. So
My understanding, my understanding is he is running, and whether or not he can make a viable contender is actually, I think that all bets are off in this particular primary, and it's going to go long and deep. And the reason for that is because I think, and you actually probably could correct me very well, but I think there's never been a Republican or Democratic primary with so many candidates in the field. Last count that I had, there are 21 Republicans running for the presidential nomination. 21.
Can you rank them, by the way, 1 to 21?
I actually did, but it'll be in a column, but I don't know if I could do it off the top of my head. Brian's personal ranking or ranking what other people think of them?
No, we could do it like brackets, like the NCAA before the tournaments.
I would totally do that. That would actually be fun. So I think definitely, I think that you have a situation where any Republican can come out of the woodwork and potentially win this time around because all of them have the potential to implode. For example, while Jeb Bush, is kind of viewed as an establishment guy, a lot of people are coming after Jeb Bush on a variety of issues, including Common Core and other things. And the Bushes, as you know, have a fair number of enemies. And so I'm not convinced he'll get the nomination. Scott Walker, obviously, I think would have been the front runner because he does something that none of the candidates do quite well, which is because unions, public employee unions in particular, are like the enemy number one of all sectors of the Republican Party, whether you're a social or a fiscal conservative. He's been able to take them on in Wisconsin, but because he hasn't really been able to graduate to prime time, his stock has diminished. So I really think any number of them can emerge. If Mike Huckabee or Rick Santorum emerge, I'm going to re-register as Green Party or something, or move to Australia.
Lindsey Graham would be pretty close to the kind of candidate you're talking about.
Or he is on like state rights for marijuana or gay marriage and stuff like that. But
yeah, the gay marriage thing is very interesting. I just don't see. I mean, I know what Paul Singer wants. Yeah. I know what Ken Mellman wants, former chairman of the RNC. What's going to happen in this first debate is Ted Cruz is going to stand up and say, I have a constitutional amendment that will return to the states the right to decide who can get married. I want everybody to raise their hands if they support that. He's just going to, it's a little like what happened to Romney. It's just push people to the right.
And this is one of the things that that this particular issue is so simple to me. And I don't know why one Republican doesn't come up and say it and then every Republican say it. All they have to say to satisfy their base and to do the right thing, by the way, is say, the role of government is to recognize contracts, and the government will recognize contracts between anyone who wants to have a contract. The government has no role in being involved in marriage because we're a limited government party. And churches decide who they married, but the government's going to recognize contracts between any two people, or three people, or four people, for all I care. But that's kind of dirty. And so
Orange County Register endorses polygamy.
So if they came out,
Brian just got a job at the Salt Lake City Tribune.
there was a former editor of the Orange County Register or publisher who is now the editor of Playboy magazine. So I'm saying there is a trajectory here. But I think it's a very easy limited government argument, which also satisfies the social and cultural critique.
We're going to come back to questions about Brian's future career trajectory in just a moment, but in the meantime, sir. Well, very tricky question for both parties at this point. Who wants to go first? The question, for those of you who didn't hear it, is about the much more complicated political challenge that Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu present in the aftermath of last week's elections and the Obama administration's reaction to the election outcome.
Well, look, I think it was a mistake for Netanyahu to over-identify with any one party in this country. That actually started in 2012 with Romney's visit to Israel, where he basically got a semi-endorsement. I think the campaign and the government are different entities, and I think Netanyahu is now going to try to find a way back to at least a civil relationship with President Obama. I think Democrats will continue to be very supportive of Israel. I don't think there will be a great deal of support necessarily for settlements, for example, outside existing settlement blocks. But I don't see a large-scale movement of Jewish voters who voted overwhelmingly for Obama away from the Democratic Party because of what's happened here. What I do see is something of a split in the American Jewish community, which Netanyahu is going to have to deal with.
And Brian, I want to come to you in just a second, but Bob, to follow up first, the New York Times did, I thought, an excellent analysis on this a few days ago, in which they, like you, agreed that the Jewish Democrats are not going to abandon their support of Israel in any way, shape, or form. But the article also made the point that a lot of other components of the Democratic base, primarily minority voters and younger voters, are not nearly as strong in their support of Israel as the party traditionally has been. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that as a potential challenge going forward, or do you think it's overblown?
I think it's overblown. I think the Democratic nominee, whoever she may be, will be pro-Israel.
So you think Warren will be pro-Israel?
Will be pro-Israel, and there will be noise, there always has been, from certain other elements in the party. It doesn't matter. But there is a point at which, I'll tell you the next test. The next test is not how Israel deals with the two-state solution Netanyahu's tried to say again. Now he believes in it. But it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. The conditions just aren't there. The next test is going to be the agreement with Iran, if we get one. And how do the Israelis react to that? How do they deal with it? And what is their answer to the question, which has yet to be answered, what is your alternative? That'll be the next test of the relationship, not just with both parties, but with the U.S. itself.
And Brian, this certainly complicates things for Republicans also. Just yesterday, Jeb Bush had to leap into the issue because one of his most prominent foreign policy advisors, the former Secretary of State James Baker, talked about Israel in a way that the Republican Party base was not particularly happy with, and Bush had to rush in and reassure conservative voters that he, unlike Baker, still considered himself to be a very stalwart supporter of Netanyahu.
Sure, and yeah, I actually think in this particular instance is one of the few policy instances Republicans have it a little bit easier, at least in the primary setting. You know, there's going to be a race to show who's more pro-Israel and the most pro-Israel. It's just part of the Republican DNA at this point in modern history. And interestingly enough, you could, you know, the obvious argument against me, right, is, well, what about Rand Paul? Rand Paul's kind of an isolationist and believes in limited foreign policy. But Rand Paul's even trying to push himself to look more pro-Israel because he knows that the biggest donors and the biggest supporters in this country of Israel are targeting him, and they could be his biggest hindrance on the campaign trail, and likely will be. So I think on the Republican side, the more that Netanyahu has talked about, the more that there's some kind of a issue in the relationship between President Obama and Netanyahu, and the more that this is a national narrative, it actually benefits Republicans. Whether that's good or bad for the country, we could debate that. But I think that in terms of pure politics, it's an easier issue for Republicans to navigate than Democrats.
I'll take moderator's prerogative on this one very quickly, because we want to make sure other people have a chance to ask questions. But it appears now that, barring a very significant surprise, that although Netanyahu's Likud party only won 30 out of the 120 seats in the Israeli Knesset, that they are very, very well positioned to put together a governing majority, primarily with conservative and religious parties. And so while there certainly are a large number of people in Israel who did not vote for either Likud or another conservative party, it looks like the Israeli government for the foreseeable future will reflect Netanyahu's preferences and priorities. I'll add this real quickly before we go on, moderator's prerogative number 2. As some of you may know, we put out a book last year in cooperation with the Kasdan Institute for Jewish Studies here at USC, a book that I edited on Jewish politics in America. And what our researchers found, every single one of them from a slightly different perspective, is that while these issues have critical real-world import, in terms of domestic politics, our researchers found that increasing numbers every year in every election, the American Jewish community prioritizes domestic issues, primarily social and cultural issues, to a much greater degree over issues relating to Israel and the Middle East. So again, critically important discussion for real-world purposes, but as I think Bob alluded to in his remarks, as it relates to at least the Jewish vote in this campaign, probably not as relevant. Alex, you wanted to weigh in, I know.
Going off of that, given the potentially frayed relationship between President Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, the ongoing threat of ISIS and the current Iran negotiations, in general, to what extent will foreign policy as a whole play in this presidential election in comparison to previous presidential elections?
I mean, I think it's too early to tell. Certainly, this year, as Republicans campaign on the campaign trail and Democrats start to trickle in, I think, to the race, it'll be important. But, you know, what's going to happen with the economy at the end of this year? What's going to happen to the economy at the beginning of next year? So a lot of people tried to argue that last year, the election between Mitt Romney and Obama would come down to foreign policy, and obviously it didn't. And there was other things. McCain and Obama, a lot of people tried to argue that is going to be a foreign policy election. And then obviously we had a crash in the markets, right? So I think it's too early to tell. I think for the foreseeable future, it will be a big issue, and it will probably stay at least an important theme throughout the campaign, because Republicans, and particularly whoever the Republican nominee is going to try to take Hillary Clinton on her record as Secretary of State. So foreign policy, I think, will play a more prominent role than perhaps the Romney-Obama election. But it's too, for me, and you know, you've been on the campaign and probably can predict this kind of stuff better, but for me, I don't know that it will be the dominant theme.
No, unless there's a terrorist attack here or something catastrophic happens, I don't think it will be dominant. I think domestic issues will be more important. And I think it's a snare and a delusion for Republicans to believe that somehow they can turn this into the Benghazi election. I mean, one thing I think is very important for both parties is to talk about the future. If Hillary gets up there and says, I have all this experience, and I used to work on education in Arkansas, and I've done this, and I've been Secretary of State, and therefore you should be for me. You know, people already know all that. They want to know where she's going to take the country. And this is a challenge, by the way, for Republicans, too, because they've got to come up with a coherent economic program that's actually paid for, because you get into the debates and they're going to get pressed the way Romney ultimately got pressed on how you pay for this stuff. And they've got to come up with some coherent program on health care. I mean, I wanted Lindsey Graham yesterday was asked about Ted Cruz's thing that he wants to repeal every sentence of Obamacare. And Graham said that's ridiculous, we shouldn't be for it, and it can't happen. I mean, are we really going to tell people they're going to be denied insurance for pre-existing conditions? Are we really going to tell them that when they get cancer, their life insurance company can say, or their health insurance company can say, sorry, buddy, you reached your $300,000 limit? And are we really going to throw millions of kids off their parents' health care? So I think Republicans have the challenge of coming up with a coherent domestic program that goes beyond cutting taxes.
All right, let's open it up again. Sam?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sam, I'm a senior. Question is actually about Governor Cuomo. You know, these two, what do you think their chances are?
Question is about Governor Cuomo of New York and Governor Perry of Texas. Why don't you each take the one in your own party?
I wanted to take both. No, you know, and I'm, you know, well, my own party, I barely registered as a Republican, but I am technically registered as a Republican, I guess. And I'm definitely not registering as a Democrat, so I can.
No, we heard you say green, so we were.
No,
ready.
that's maybe where I'm moving. I might start my own party, the Kaye Party. It sounds pretty good. I think that Rick Perry, a lot of the donor, he'll have a national donor base. People like what he's done in Texas. He was governor for 14 years, I think, which is a very long time. On business issues, he's really good, but again, he says crazy things now and then, and people don't forget that. And I think that he calls me when he comes to town, a nice man, very affable. But I think you know, putting glasses on doesn't change who you are. Number one. Number two, you know, he had one of the silliest gaffes that I've heard on the campaign. There are two silly gaffes the Republicans have made thus far, and this was before he was running for president. And he was up in San Francisco, you know, which is a place where, you know, the gay rights movement was essentially born in this country, right? And he said he likened homosexuality to alcoholism. I just don't think that you don't recover from that. And he's had similar gaffes, as you remember from the debates. So I think that that Governor Perry will go into it, and then he'll quickly get out and put his support behind someone else.
Bob, I know how much you like to talk about Governor Perry, but what do you think about Andrew Cuomo?
I think Andrew Cuomo is totally blocked as long as Hillary Clinton is running. I think if she weren't running, he would seriously get involved and try to run. I think he has to become more user-friendly to be a successful nominee, but he'd be a formidable force. He's been a very good governor of New York. I have a friend in the Republican Party who tells me that Rick Perry's actually a lot smarter than I think. But that will be tested very early on in this process.
I mean, judging from his glasses, they look good.
Nick, did you have a question?
Yeah.
It's a great question. Is being the third Bush to run for president in a quarter century a helpful or an unhelpful thing, Brian?
It gets him the establishment money to start with, and I'll let Brian talk about the pros and cons of it in a broader context. I am struck by the resistance inside the Republican Party to the idea of a third Bush.
Yeah, I mean, I have a rant on this. How much time do we have left?
We have enough time for a half rant.
Okay, I could do a half rant. You know, in an ideal world, Jeb Bush would be judged as his own man, right? And I hope that is the case. With that said, I know a lot of I spent Orange County is kind of like the Republican conservative donor hub, one of them in the country, and so they all come through to raise money. And so I'm friends and talk with all the mega donors, all the bundlers, etc. And a lot of them are concerned with this potential of having that last name, which has such a bad brand. And secondarily, they're hedging their bets. So a lot of them who are supporting Bush are also supporting a secondary candidate as well, just to do so. So it's an issue that a lot of people are grappling with. I've heard, and my understanding is, he's setting up organizations, other political organizations, that are meant to go out and essentially rebrand him and tell stories and make the debate about ideas and his ideas as opposed to his name, which I think is really interesting and really helpful. So that's, objective analysis. Angry Brian, who's not very angry, I'm kind of a happy warrior most days, is that we fought a war in this country over inherited power. And to think that we would have another Bush presidency in such a short time, or even another Clinton presidency in such a short time, or to have Clinton versus Bush be the two choices we have, would be very disappointing to me at a time where I think that our country is changing in such an interesting and vibrant way from a technological perspective, from a cultural perspective, and to go back and say we're going to give this power to people whose families have already been in power is, to me, a travesty.
And he'll certainly be back quite a few times between now and then. But let this be an invitation to Brian to come join us in the year 2036 when Chelsea Clinton and George P. Bush run against each other for president of the United
I won't
States.
be able to make it.
Before we thank our panelists, just a few quick announcements. Number one, next Wednesday for our Students Talk Back lunch, we'll shift the discussion back from politics to policy. And we'll talk next week about the changing face of transportation in California, about high-speed rail, about Uber and Lyft, about light rail, and other commuter options here in Los Angeles and in other urban areas around the state. Should be an excellent conversation. Lunch at 11:30 and the panel discussion at noon. Next Wednesday evening, a week from tonight, as many of you know, we co-sponsor with the Political Student Assembly a roundtable discussion with our legislators and residents, former State Senator Mark Weiland and former Assemblyman Anthony Portantino. That'll be 1 week from tonight in Mudd Hall, room 102. Next Thursday evening, something a little bit different, is we're going to be co-sponsoring a program with a group called Women Voices Now. And we will screen a short film followed by a panel discussion about oppression and violence against women in the Muslim world. And we'll make the case very, very clearly then that Islam, of course, as a faith, is not a faith that oppresses women. And the challenges that women face in this regard are not limited to any single religion, faith, or community. But it should be a very interesting discussion. We'll be in Doheny Library, room 240, and we encourage you to join us for that. And then finally, and most importantly, at least for some of you, is, as many of you know, every year the Unruh Institute gives out internships, scholarships, and awards for students who are looking for summer internships and may not be able to fully afford transportation and housing and living expenses, particularly in other places around the country, Washington, Sacramento, and elsewhere. The deadline for applications for those awards is April 8th, a week from today. And we'd encourage you to either look at our website or to come to VKC 263 to get some guidance as to how to apply for those awards, because we really do make it a huge priority to make sure that no USC student who's interested in doing an internship is unable to do so because of financial obstacles. So we'll do anything we can to not only help you find an internship for the summer, but make sure you have some degree of financial support that enables you to do it. All those announcements aside, join me, please, in thanking my co-moderator, Alex Glaser, for joining us today. Alex, thank you very, very much. Our panelists, our friend and our regular panelist, Bob Shrum. Bob, thank you so much for being here, as always. And our special guest, and Brian, we will certainly have you back many, many times before 2036, but thank you for coming back to campus. Let's thank Brian Kaye also. Let's also thank the Unruh Institute team. Let's thank Kirsten Olson. Let's thank Elisa Rangel. Let's thank Tanya Mercado. Let's thank Jody Epstein, and especially Laura Hill for the work they do in putting together these programs every week. Guys, thank you very much. And finally, thanks to all of you for attending. We'll look forward to seeing you at future programs. Have a great day.